Hey everybody, how are you doing? This is Megumi again for the International Framework for Environmental Protection, lecture number 6. And today I will say about the biodiversity loss of the world. Here are the keywords: biodiversity, habitat, IUCN. This is for International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, and Nagoya Protocol and Aichi Target. So let's study about the biodiversity today. So there are some questions. What is your opinion? Is mankind the only life on this planet? Of course not. Can humans survive without other lives? This is impossible also. Are humans the best creature on this planet? Never. So, thinking this, let's begin. So, I suggest that you watch these videos on biodiversity. For example, this Amazon rainforest is on fire. Another one, rescuers race to save Australia's wildlife, animal kind. This is also the same time, 2 minutes and 50 seconds. Okay. So what's biodiversity? Biodiversity is comprised of several levels, starting with genes, individual species, communities of creatures, and entire ecosystems. And what is ecosystems? Ecosystems are polar regions, deserts, oceans, islands, swamps, forests, or coral reefs, where life interplays with the physical environment. These myriad interactions have made Earth habitable for billions of years. And we have 3 different levels of diversity: species, genetic, and ecosystem. Species diversity is the number of different species in the biosphere or in a particular region. And genetic diversity is the amount of variation in the genetic material within all members of a population. And ecosystem diversity, variety of habitats, living communities, and ecological processes in the living world. So, bio means plants, animals, life. And diversity means variability and variety of the species. So here is the definition of biodiversity. Biodiversity or biological diversity is a term that describes the variety of living beings on Earth. It is described as degree of variation of life. Biological diversity encompasses microorganisms, plants, animals, and ecosystems. Biodiversity also refers to the number or abundance of different species living within a particular region. It represents the wealth of biological resources available to us. And it's all about the sustaining the natural area made up of community of plants, animals, and other living things. And today I will show you about the biodiversity loss problem. And biodiversity loss, on the other hand, is the death of ecosystems. Either the entire ecosystem is destroyed because of human intervention, including deforestation, as for example, bushfire, logging, urban development and farming, or enough key species in an ecosystem die that the ecosystem collapses on its own. And biodiversity loss is the decline in the number, genetic variability, and variety of species and biological communities. This loss in the variety of life can lead to a breakdown in the functioning of the ecosystem where decline has happened. And we have two types of biodiversity loss. First is natural biodiversity loss, and second is human-driven biodiversity loss. Well, natural biodiversity loss, this occurs naturally. So biodiversity loss is typically associated with more permanent ecological changes in ecosystems, landscapes, and the global biosphere. And natural ecological disturbances, such as wildfire, floods, and volcanic eruptions, change ecosystems drastically by eliminating local populations of some species and transforming whole biological communities. Such disturbances are temporary, however, because natural disturbances are common and ecosystems have adapted to their challenges repeatedly. So, for example, this is the example of the natural biological loss. This happened in January of this year, 2020, volcano eruption and subsequent tsunami hit the Tonga Island. And this happened on January 15 of this year, 2022. This picture was taken by UNICEF. The great thing about that is that in this island, COVID hasn't reached the shores of Tonga. One case made it through, but they caught it while the person was still in quarantine, and it wasn't transmitted to the community. But last month, I read on the newspaper that now Tonga Island is contaminated by the COVID. Maybe many people came to help them, and they brought also COVID. And how about the natural disasters in Tonga? This leads also to the biodiversity loss. Over the last few years, Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, has been supporting Tonga in its response to a range of shocks and disasters, including Tropical Cyclone Winston in 2016, drought following El Nino in 2016 to 2017, Tropical Cyclone Gita in 2018, in the continuing impact on fishing communities of the 2014 Tropical Cyclone Ian. So many natural disasters happened. And FAO has also provided support in a number of countries hit by recent volcanic eruptions. These include providing critical support both before and after the eruption of the La Soufrière volcano in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines in 2021. FAO focused on protecting livelihoods and averting a deterioration in food security. It helped to evacuate animals, restock lost livestock, and provide seeds and tools to enable affected families to get back on their feet as quickly as possible. And the problem hasn't ended yet. It continues after this eruption, but nobody remembers because now everybody is looking at Ukraine, the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. So, but we have to help them giving money to the UNICEF or United Nations organization. So, after the natural disaster has happened in this country, in Tonga, we have to help them, and also we have to think about the biodiversity loss. So the problem will begin, it's still going on, and so we have to pay attention to that aspect of Tonga Island. So let's see now about the human-driven biodiversity loss. Biodiversity losses caused by humans tend to be more severe and longer lasting. Humans, Homo sapiens, their crops and their food animals take up an increasing share of Earth's land areas, as we saw in the previous lecture about the deforestation. Half of the world's habitable land, some 51 million square kilometers, has been converted to agriculture, and some 77% of agricultural land, some 40 million square kilometers, is used for grazing cattle, sheep, goats, and other livestock. This massive conversion of forests, wetlands, grasslands, and other terrestrial ecosystems has produced a 60% decline on average in the number of vertebrates worldwide since 1970, with the greatest losses in vertebrate populations occurring in freshwater habitats, 83%, and in South and Central America, 89%. This is a very big number. Between 1970 and 2014, the human population grew from about 3.7 billion to 7.3 billion people. So many people. So this is another very good video on humans, biodiversity, and habitat loss. This is a HHMI bio-interactive video of 33 minutes. It is interesting, and you should take a look at this. This 30-minute video lists human activities and their threats to biodiversity. In the second lecture of the series, Biodiversity in the Age of Humans, Dr. Elizabeth Headley of Stanford University reveals how human activities have caused the extinctions of many species in the past and the present. Human population growth is driving habitat destruction and climate change, both direct threats to biodiversity. This is another one. 50 years ago, this was a wasteland. He changed everything. This is a short film showcase. This is an American that restored the forest. Almost 50 years ago, fried chicken tycoon David Bamberger used his fortune to purchase 5,500 acres of overgrazed land in the Texas Hill Country. Planting grasses to soak in rains and fill hillside aquifers, Bamberger devoted the rest of his life to restoring the degraded landscape. Today, the land has been restored to its original habitat and boasts enormous biodiversity. Bamberger's model of land stewardship is now being replicated across the region, and he is considered to be a visionary in land management and water conservation. In our lecture, I remember that we saw another video about a researcher that said that grazing is very important for the restoration of degraded land. So this video is the opposite. So this land was overgrazed and it was degraded land. And so he put all the livestock out from this land, and so he could restore the land. So it is interesting to watch both videos, I think. This is another one. Want to solve wildfires and drought? Leave it to beavers. This is another story about the beavers. So this is also very interesting to restore the sound, natural watershed. Take the PBS Digital Studios audience survey. This. More and more scientists are starting to ask the question, could beavers be the ally we've been waiting for when it comes to saving the environment? Travel with host Joe Henson to Central Oregon, where a group of scientists set up a kind of beaver laboratory to learn more about the crepuscular creatures. They will also speak with a scientist who studies how beavers help to mitigate wildfire and drought. So not only humans, but we can ask for help to the other animals, other vertebrates. This is the video that I love because this is entirely natural. The Seeds We Sow, documentary movie of Takachiho, Miyazaki Prefecture of Japan in Kyushu. This is a very beautiful video. I think you watch them 5 minutes or less, but you could understand how beautiful is the nature. And this is a documentary movie about the people engaging in agriculture in Takachiho, Miyazaki Prefecture of Japan in Kyushu. It focuses on not only the rejoice of life in Takachiho, but some issues to be solved as well. The production is Takachiho Town Song, Itsue Film, Move Emotions Inc. GIAHS, Takachiho Go Shibayama official website. And approximately 92% of the site in forest that is mostly on sloped land. And despite these harsh conditions, people have been carrying out a composite system of agricultural forestry to sustain their lifestyles while striking a balance between conservation and the effective utilization of the forest. This word, agricultural forestry, is another key word for restoring both forest and both agricultural land, overgrazed land, for example. So you can make a good use of the shades of the forest and practicing the cultivation of crops under the shade. And the forest also can make use of the phosphorus from the vegetation, from the crops. So both sides will be beneficial each other. And this video says that the workings of this system have fostered the conservation of rare plants and animals that inhabit the forests and farms. Beautiful landscapes that include sloping mountains covered in rice terraces, as well as traditional culture such as the religious performance known as kagura, which brings the mythology and folklore of ancient Japan into modern times. This composite system of agricultural forestry has been evaluated as a globally important traditional system and was certified as a globally important agricultural heritage system in December 2015. And this GEAHS, globally important agricultural heritage systems, are sites in which culturally important and traditional forms of agriculture, forestry, and fishing, agricultural, forestry, and fishery systems are carried out. These sites are evaluated and certified by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, FAO, and under this system, there are currently, as of February 2020, 52 recognized sites in 21 countries worldwide, with 11 of those sites located in Japan. Maybe in your country, you have some of these sites, don't you have? So now, let's see about the causes of biodiversity loss. First is habitat destruction. Habitat destruction is a major cause for biodiversity loss. Habitat loss is caused by deforestation, overpopulation, pollution, and global warming. Species which are physically large and those living in forests or oceans are more affected by habitat reduction. As for example, you should take a look at this Brazilian Amazon deforestation for better understanding. And continuing, some experts estimate that around 30% of all species on Earth will be extinct by 2050. According to the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, globally about 1/3 of all known species are threatened with extinction. Even it is estimated that 25% of all mammals will be extinct within 20 years. Global warming is also becoming a major cause for loss of biodiversity. For example, if the present rate of global warming continues, coral reefs, which are biodiversity hotspots, will disappear in 20 to 40 years. The most favorable temperature of the sea surface is 15 degrees centigrade. But these days, it is so hot. Sometimes in the summer areas, it is up to 28 degrees centigrade to up to 30 degrees centigrade. So if it is so hot, the coral reef cannot survive, because for the coral reef, 15 degrees is the ideal, the most good temperature. Even if a small element of an ecosystem breaks down, the whole system's balance is threatened. Freshwater ecosystems are nowadays the most threatened ecosystems. That's why frogs, the amphibious species are declining very quickly. That's why. Because freshwater ecosystems are the more threatened ecosystems. And invasive species refer to those that would normally remain constrained from an ecosystem because of the presence of natural barriers. Since these barriers are no longer existing, invasive species invade the ecosystem, destroying native species. And human activities have been the major cause for encouraging invasive species. And species can also be threatened by genetic pollution, uncontrolled hybridization, and gene swamping. For instance, abundant species can interbreed with rare species, thus causing swamping of the gene pool. Overexploitation is caused by activities such as overfishing, overhunting, excessive logging, and illegal trade of wildlife. Over 25% of global fisheries are being overfished at unsustainable levels. So these facts are all anthropogenic. The humans that are acting for the biodiversity loss. So, as we saw, let's see the summary of the causes of biodiversity loss. We have habitat alteration, is a change in land use or land cover that has an impact on local ecosystems. Invasive species, species that enter new ecosystems and multiply, harming native species and their habitats, often were accidentally or even deliberately introduced by humans. Pollution, any matter or energy released into the environment that causes undesirable impacts on the health and well-being of humans or other organisms. And overharvesting or overuse. Overexploitation refers to harvesting a renewable resource to the point of diminishing returns. So, they are all human facts. So let's see now in details about the habitat alteration. There are farming practices, clearing forests. You should take a look at this video, it's very nice. Hydroelectric dams, urbanization and suburban sprawl, grazing animals and livestock. For the invasive species, we have the introduction of non-native plants and animals to new environments, make large damage and raise competition levels for resources. For pollution, we have water pollution, agricultural runoff, air pollution, oil and chemical spills. And endangered species. There are so many endangered species, especially vertebrates. For example, Siberian tiger. hunted without rules or regulations in the southeast corner of Russia in the Sikote, Alin mountain range, east of the Amur River, called Amur tiger, endangered species. Florida panther. Due to hunting and habitat destruction, the panther was reduced to a small population, 20 to 30 only, and suffered from the effects of inbreeding depression. Southern Florida in swampland, less than 100 left in wild. Others in Southeast Asia or Africa, for example, elephants, rhinos, gorillas, orangutan, minks, dolphins, whales, American eagles, butterflies, bees, and so on. There are so many endangered species in the red list. So let's take a look at this chart. The biodiversity loss is the reduction in the number of genes, individual organisms, species, and ecosystems in a given area. And the influencers for this fact is human population growth, increasing consumption, reduced resource efficiency. The human population growth will continue until 2050. And after 2050, it will begin to decrease. But we are now in 2022. So the population is still increasing, especially in the developing countries. So these influencers will result in habitat loss, thinning, fragmenting, or outright destruction of an ecosystem's plant, soil, hydrologic, and nutrient resources. Invasive species. Any non-native species that significantly modifies or disrupts the ecosystems it colonizes. The overexploitation by humans, process of harvesting too many aquatic or terrestrial animals, which depletes the stocks of some species while driving others to extinction. Pollution. Addition of any substance or any form of energy to the environment at a rate faster than it can be rendered harmless. And another is the climate change associated with global warming. Modification of Earth's climate associated with rising levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere over the past 1 to 2 centuries. So, the habitat loss and overexploitation driven by our rapid population growth are the primary causes of biodiversity loss, which is now happening up to 10,000 times faster than for millions of years before. We are in a bottleneck of overpopulation and wasteful consumption that could push half of Earth's species to extinction in this century, according to E.O. Wilson. In May 2019, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, released its global assessment, identifying the major threats to biodiversity worldwide. So now let's see at this chart, human population and extinctions. This y-axis is for the cumulative vertebrate extinctions in percent. And the x-axis is for population, human population in billions. 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion. Now we are 7 billion and a little bit more. This blue curve is for the extinction percentage. So in 1,500, this is the great navigation times in the history of the world. And it was not so high, the extinctions. And the population also was not increasing so rapidly. But after 1,700, it will begin increasing. And in the 19th century, it will increase. And after 20th century, it will explode. Explosion of the population, human population. And also the increase of the extinction of the vertebrates, animals, like tigers, elephants, rhinos, gorillas, and so on. This source is Ceballos et al., 2015, IUCN, Rosa 2017. For example, now we are in 2022. Actually, these last 5 years, each year we are losing, do you know how many vertebrates, how many species? 30,000 species each year. So it is astonishing. It's stunning figure. It is because of the human activity, anthropogenic. This is the weight of vertebrate land animals 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago. 1% humans, the weight of the humans, 1%. And 99% weight of vertebrate land animals, 99% wild animals, and humans, only 1%. Today, 32% of the weight of the vertebrate is humans. 1% wild animals, only 1%. And another 67% is for weight of livestock that humans eat. And here is 1970, and this is 2014. Wild vertebrate animal populations have halved in the period the human population has doubled. So we can see here clearly the influence of the humans, the population growth of the humans that are putting the other vertebrate animals to an extinction. Plus 95%, and wild animals minus 60% compared to 1970. The source is WWF Living Planet 2018 of the United Nations Population Division. So the influence of humans is very big in all environmental problems, especially related to the biodiversity loss. So the sixth mass extinction is this period of the big human population. Since life appeared on Earth, there have been several mass extinctions in which many species were wiped out because of natural causes. But many scientists consider the huge reduction in biodiversity since the emergence of humans is now on the scale of another mass extinction. This is known as the anthropogenic extinction or sixth mass extinction. Worldwide Fund for Nature, latest Living Planet report, estimates that we have lost 60% of all vertebrated wildlife populations since 1970. That's more than half of all birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and fish gone in just 50 years. During that time, our population has more than doubled, increasing from 3.7 billion to over 7.7 billion today. A German study found that flying insect populations, including pollinators, bees, have crashed by 3/4 since 1989, reflecting similar trends around the world. We saw in the lecture about the chemicals that the nicotinoids, the insecticide, was responsible for the loss of bees, pollinators, in these last 5 years. So, in its landmark 2019 report, IPBES, Intergovernmental Science Policy on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, reported that 1 million species are now at risk of extinction. And according to the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, Red List of Threatened Species, 41% of amphibians, frogs, 25% of mammals, 34% of conifers, this is the tree, a kind of tree of the boreal forests, 13% of birds, 31% of sharks, 31% of sharks and rays, 33% of reef-building corals, and 27% of crustaceans are threatened with extinction. So, this is because of the habitat destruction by the humans. More people need more space. Damaging human activity continues to encroach on natural environments, thereby destroying the habitats of countless species. As our population rises, cities and industrial areas are growing and merging into each other, fragmenting the remaining habitat and leaving isolated islands of natural populations of plants and animals too small to survive. According to IPBES, only 1/4 of land areas and 1/3 of oceans remain relatively undamaged by human activities. This is another problem of overexploitation. More people need more things. Humankind's relentless consumption of resources, such as timber, oil, and mineral, is continuing to destroy natural habitats around the globe. We are also putting enormous pressure on populations of wild species, both by bushmeat hunting in the developing world and by large-scale industrial fishing in our seas. Wildlife poaching and trafficking still present a huge threat to many species, including rhinos, tigers, and pangolins. For example, there are so many fishes here, but To catch, for example, one tuna, they use a very big kind of net, and they throw away the fishes that they do not need. So these fishes are thrown into the sea to catch only one tuna, for example. And the same thing is happening in the forest. To pick up one mahogany that exists, for example, in average, one mahogany in 1 hectare, for example. The bulldozer will go into the Amazonian forest, devastating, cutting all the trees until they reach the mahogany. So the other trees are left and the forest is damaged. So what the humans do is so stupid, very stupid way to catch the resources. This is the agricultural intensification. More people need more food. Humanity has developed agricultural systems which rely on monocultures, artificial fertilizers, and pesticides. Monocultures are increasingly susceptible to disease, whilst widespread pesticide use destroys insect populations indiscriminately. The growing pressure on food supplies means an increasing proportion of agricultural land is farmed intensively, with fewer off-seasons or fallow years in which to recover. Currently, livestock farming contributes to more climate emissions than the entire transport sector and is the biggest cause of deforestation. Runoff from farms pollutes water bodies and causes harmful algal blooms and the collapse of fish stocks. And we also have this problem of climate change. More people produce more greenhouse gases. Our planet is on the verge of climate crisis due to our endless production of greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide and methane. We are headed for a 3 degrees centigrade warmer world by the end of the century if we do not step up action on climate change. We are already seeing species decline due to global temperature increase. Every half a degree of warming has a huge knock-on effect on ecosystems, with mobile species running out of areas to migrate to and temperature-sensitive organisms like corals undergoing massive die-offs. When keystone species like reef-building corals disappear, the rich and complex ecosystems they support collapse as well. Because coral reefs is just like a forest on land. It is the nurturing place for the small fishes, and it is very easy for the small fishes to hide from the big fishes. So if they lose this coral reef, many species will also lose their habitats. And pollution is another problem. More people produce more waste and more pollution. As we saw in the lecture, in the previous lecture, our oceans are becoming choked with plastic waste which is killing millions of animals, from sea turtles to whales. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation estimates that by 2050, there will be more plastic than fish in the sea. As populations increase, the disposal of waste, in particular hazardous waste, becomes an increasingly serious issue. As well as affecting the lives of humans, noise, light, and chemical pollution can disrupt wildlife behavior. Light from human activities makes it harder for predator species to catch their prey. Noise pollution interrupts both hunting and mating signals in many species, disturbing natural behavior. And this is another problem, invasive species. More people means more trouble. Human travel across the world has a very large emissions footprint, but it has also allowed the spread of invasive species, both accidental and intentional. As a consequence of the introduction of non-native species to some areas, such as rabbits and cats in Australia, goats on St. Helena, and American mink in Great Britain, we have put many vulnerable ecosystems at risk, threatening native species and diminishing biodiversity. This is the causes of wildlife declines globally by WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature. This is the causes of wildlife declines globally. WWF's Living Planet Index categorizes the causes of wildlife declines based on analysis of 3,430 species populations. The exploitation is 37%. Then comes habitat degradation or change, 31%, habitat loss, 13%, other, 11%, and climate change, 7%. So there's so much life on this planet that it is estimated 86% of species are still undiscovered, according to National Geographic, August 25 of 2011. And it is estimated that half of all the species on the planet could go extinct by 2050, only 30 years from now. This is according to the Global Citizen, February 27, 2017. Another, it's estimated that in the last 4 decades, we've lost more than 50% of the planet's biodiversity. This is according to The Guardian, 30 September 2014, WWF. So there are many different figures for the biodiversity loss, but it is becoming very serious. So let's now see about the United Nations Decade on Biodiversity. So the United Nations designated 2011 to 2020 as the United Nations Decade on Biodiversity. In biodiversity, each species, no matter how big or small, has an important role to play in ecosystem. So why is biodiversity important? Well, biodiversity has a number of functions on the earth. These are as follows: maintaining balance of the ecosystem, recycling and storage of nutrients, combating pollution and stabilizing climate, protecting water resources, forming and protecting soil, and maintaining eco-balance. Another one is provision of biological resources. So, provision of medicines and pharmaceuticals, food for the human population and animals, ornamental plants, wood products, breeding stock and diversity of species, ecosystems, and genes. Another function is social benefits, recreation and tourism, cultural value, and education and research. Biodiversity and food. 80% of human food supply comes from 20 kinds of plants. But humans use 40,000 species for food, clothing, and shelter. Biodiversity provides for a variety of foods for the planet. It's getting cold. Let's see now about another function of biodiversity. Biodiversity and human health. The shortage of drinking water is expected to create a major global crisis. Biodiversity also plays an important role in drug discovery and medicinal resources. Medicines from nature account for usage by 80% of the world's population. And biodiversity and industry. Biological sources provide many industrial materials. These include fiber, oil, dyes, rubber, water, timber, paper, and food. Another function, biodiversity and culture. Biodiversity enhances recreational activities like bird watching, fishing, trekking, and so on. It inspires musicians and artists. Now let's see at the red list of these endangered animals. The IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, created a red list to better acclimate society to how threatened our world is. Using the conservation status, the red list can tell everyday members of society just how many species are extinct, how many species are endangered, or how many species are safe from extinction. To take a look at the red list, you should click this https://iucnredlist.org. So now let's see at the relevant laws, rules, and treaties regarding biodiversity. The first one was in 1920, Multiple Use Act of 1920. Directed that the national forests be managed for timber, watershed, range, outdoor recreation, wildlife, and fish purposes. Another one, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, CITES, 1963. This is an international agreement between governments to ensure that international trade in wild animals and plants do not threaten their survival. Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972 established federal responsibility to conserve marine animals. Another one, Endangered Species Act of 1973, provided a program for the conservation of threatened and endangered plants and animals and the habitats in which they are found. And nowadays we have this Convention on Biological Diversity. It was opened for signature on June 5th, 1992 at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, the Rio Earth Summit, and entered into force on December 29th, 1993. This was the first international environmental conference. And then after that, we have this, the Nagoya Protocol on Access to Genetic Resources and the Fair and Equitable Sharing of Benefits was adopted on October 29th, 2010 in Nagoya, Japan. As I live in Nagoya, I participated this conference as an interpreter. So let's see more details on the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Very long title. The protocol significantly advanced the Convention's third objective by providing a strong basis for greater legal certainty and transparency for both providers and users of genetic resources. The protocol's provisions on access to traditional knowledge held by indigenous and local communities when it is associated with genetic resources will strengthen to benefit from that. And it is a supplementary agreement to the Convention on Biological Diversity. It provides a transparent legal framework for the effective implementation of one of the three objectives of the CBD: the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. So Nagoya Protocol is more for the economical side, and Aichi target is more for the biological biodiversity function. The merits of the Nagoya Protocol. The protocol was adopted on October 29, 2010 in Nagoya, Japan. Its objective is the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources, thereby contributing to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So we have this strategic plan for biodiversity that includes 20 time-bound measurable targets to be met by the year 2020. This is the Aichi biodiversity targets. Because Nagoya is in Aichi Prefecture, Japan, the name is Aichi Biodiversity Targets. There are 20 Aichi Biodiversity Targets. So let's see each one. So first one is for the strategic goal A. This addresses the underlying causes of biodiversity loss by mainstreaming biodiversity across government and society. The target one, by 2020 at the latest, people are aware of the values of biodiversity and the steps they can take to conserve and use it sustainably. So that's why nowadays in Japan, for example, little children know very well about the biodiversity because it is incentivized to the school for the teachers of elementary school to teach the children about the biodiversity. And the targets too. By 2020 at the latest, biodiversity values have been integrated into national and local development and poverty reduction strategies and planning processes and are being incorporated into national accounting as appropriate and reporting systems. Target 3, by 2020 at the latest, incentives including subsidies harmful to biodiversity are eliminated, phased out or reformed in order to minimize or avoid negative impacts, and positive incentives for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity are developed and applied, consistent and in harmony with the Convention and other relevant international obligations, taking into account national socio-economic conditions. Target 4, by 2020 at the latest, governments, business, and stakeholders at all levels have taken steps to achieve or have implemented plans for sustainable production and consumption and have kept the impacts of use of natural resources well within safe ecological limits. This conference on the biodiversity is held each 2 years. And last year in 2021, it was held in China because of the COVID-19. It was postponed to 2021, just like the Tokyo Olympic Games was postponed. So it is a 2 years cycle, but this year, 2022, will be held in Turkey. So let's see target 4. We have 20 targets. So let us see each one. By 2020 at the latest, governments, business, and stakeholders at all levels have taken steps to achieve or have implemented plans for sustainable production and consumption and have kept the impacts of use of natural resources well within safe ecological limits. Target 5 and 6 are the strategic goal B, reduce the direct pressures on biodiversity and promote sustainable use. So the target 5, by 2020, the rate of loss of all natural habitats, including forests, is at least halved and where feasible brought close to zero, and degradation and fragmentation is significantly reduced. Target 6, by 2020, all fish and invertebrate stocks and aquatic plants are managed and harvested sustainably, legally, and applying ecosystem-based approaches so that overfishing is avoided. Recovery plans and measures are in place for all depleted species. Fisheries have no significant adverse impacts on threatened species and vulnerable ecosystems, and the impacts of fisheries on stocks, species, and ecosystems are within safe ecological limits. Target 7, by 2020, areas under agriculture, aquaculture, and forestry are managed sustainably, ensuring conservation of biodiversity. Target 8, by 2020, pollution, including from excess nutrients, has been brought to levels that are not detrimental to ecosystem function and biodiversity. Target 9, by 2020, invasive alien species and pathways are identified and prioritized. Priority species are controlled or eradicated, and measures are in place to manage pathways to prevent their introduction and establishment. Target 10, by 2015, the multiple anthropogenic pressures on coral reefs and other vulnerable ecosystems impacted by climate change or ocean acidification are minimized so as to maintain their integrity and functioning. Now, this is the strategic goal C, to improve the status of biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity. Target 11, by 2020, at least 17% of terrestrial and inland water and 10% of coastal and marine areas, especially areas of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services, are conserved through effectively and equitably managed, ecologically representative, and well-connected systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, and integrated into the wider landscapes and seascapes. Target 12. By 2020, the extinction of known threatened species has been prevented, and their conservation status, particularly of those most in decline, has been improved and sustained. Target 13. By 2020, the genetic diversity of cultivated plants and farmed and domesticated animals and of wild relatives, including other socio-economically as well as culturally valuable species, is maintained, and strategies have been developed and implemented for minimizing genetic erosion and safeguarding the genetic diversity. Now, this is the strategic goal D, enhance the benefits to all from biodiversity and ecosystem services. Target 14. By 2020, ecosystems that provide essential services, including services related to water and contribute to health, livelihoods, and well-being are restored and safeguarded, taking into account the needs of women, indigenous and local communities, and the poor and vulnerable. Target 15. By 2020, ecosystem resilience and the contribution of biodiversity to carbon stocks has been enhanced through conservation and restoration, including restoration of at least 15% of degraded ecosystems, thereby contributing to climate change mitigation and adaptation and to combating desertification. Target 16. By 2015, the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization is in force and operational, consistent with national legislation. So these are the targets for the strategic goal D, enhance the benefits to all from biodiversity and ecosystem services. Now, strategic goal E. This is true. We have target 17 and target 18. Enhance implementation through participatory planning, knowledge management, and capacity building. Target 17. By 2015, each party has developed, adopted as a policy instrument, and has commenced implementing an effective, participatory, and updated national biodiversity strategy and action plan. Target 18. By 2020, the traditional knowledge, innovations, and practices of indigenous and local communities relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and their customary use of biological resources are respected, subject to national legislation and relevant international obligations, and fully integrated and reflected in the implementation of the Convention, with the full and effective participation of indigenous and local communities at all relevant levels. So when I went to the COP 10 in 2010 in Nagoya conference, I saw a group of the indigenous people with the local people discussing about the use of the medicinal plants. It was a seminar, and the speaker was an indigenous lady. So we have for the strategic goal, target 19 and target 20. Target 19. By 2020, knowledge, the science base and technologies relating to biodiversity, its values, functioning, status, and trends, and the consequences of its loss are improved, widely shared and transferred and applied. Target 20. By 2020, at the latest, the mobilization of financial resources for effectively implementing the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020 from all sources and in accordance with the consolidated and agreed process in the Strategy for Resource Mobilization should increase substantially from the current levels. This target will be subject to changes contingent to resource needs assessment to be developed and reported by parties. So each 2 years are held the conference. So you can check these 20 targets, how they are working, how it is stopping, what is the problem, why it is not going on. So it's very important to pay attention to the results of the discussion of each conference held each 2 years. This year will be in Turkey. So for this conference, we have this data of IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And the IUCN Species Program provides advice to parties, other governments, and partners on the implementation of the strategic plan for biodiversity and its ⑦ biodiversity targets that I spoke now, 2011 to 2020. It is also heavily involved in work towards the targets themselves. The IUCN Species Program. In particular, it is involved in implementation of Target 9, as I read, invasive species, and Target 11, about the protected areas and identification of key biodiversity areas. The IUCN Species Program works closely with the World Commission on Protected Areas and the Species Survival Commission to develop and disseminate guidance for protected areas. Such guidance includes categories and criteria for protected areas, protected area governance, a global standard for the identification of key biodiversity areas. And the Target 12 is for the conservation of species. And ⑦ Biodiversity Target 12 calls for the establishment of conservation plans for species that are most threatened with extinction. Thus, a primary step to achieve ⑦ Target 12 is to understand the extinction risk posed to species through making conservation assessments of targeted species. The achievement of Target 12 is linked to progress towards many of the other ⑦ targets. Species threat assessments form the baseline of biodiversity data to inform decision-making. For example, for the identification of sites for protected areas, Target 11, ensuring no species is threatened through trade, Targets 4 and 6. And for the control and eradication of alien invasive species, Target 9. So now let's see about the contribution of the IUCN species programs to Target 12. It's through the maintenance and management of the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species knowledge product, including the species assessments and all associated guidance, documentation, standards and criteria for species assessments, and technical and policy advice. The global list of threatened species provides the basis for Target 12 to help identify species for conservation action. In addition to the provision of this data, the IUCN Species Program also works closely with the Species Survival Commission to both implement species conservation action on the ground and ex situ, and to develop and share guidance on species conservation action. So now I'll put here to finalize the ⑦ biodiversity targets summary. Strategic Goal A, address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss by mainstreaming biodiversity across government and society. And Strategic Goal B, reduce the direct pressures on biodiversity and promote sustainable use. Strategic Goal C, to improve the status of biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity. Strategic Goal D, enhance the benefits to all from biodiversity and ecosystem services. Strategic Goal E, enhance implementation through participatory planning, knowledge management, and capacity building. So, the United Nations Biodiversity Conference, COP15, including online high segment. The UN Biodiversity Conference, 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, COP15 to the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, 10th meeting of the Conference of the Parties serving as the meeting of the parties to the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, COP-MOP10, and the 4th meeting of the Conference of the Parties serving as the meeting of the parties to the Nagoya Protocol on Access to Genetic Resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization, NP-MOP4, in Kunming, China, was held in 2 parts. Last year, as I said, it was postponed from 2020 to 2021 because of the COVID-19. And the conference saw the adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, providing a strategic vision and a global roadmap for the conservation, protection, restoration, and sustainable management of biodiversity and ecosystems for the next decade. So the main objective of the conference, COP15, was the lead up to the conference and the related meetings provided the global community with further opportunities to galvanize efforts at all levels to build a better future in harmony with nature and to continue efforts to achieve the Aichi biodiversity targets. The CBD Secretariat will continue to monitor further developments regarding the ongoing uncertainties caused by the pandemic and announce any further changes that may become necessary. The main objective of the conference was to adopt the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Draft 1 of the framework, released in July 2021, builds on lessons learned from the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020, and it is Aichi biodiversity targets. It recognizes that urgent policy action globally, regionally, and nationally is required to transform economic, social, and financial models so the trends that have exacerbated biodiversity loss would stabilize by 2030 and allow for the recovery of natural ecosystems with net improvements by 2050. The next conference on biodiversity, COP16, will be held in Turkey in 2022, this year. So, thank you very much for your patience. It was a so long lecture. These are the reference for this lecture. There are books and sites. The Biological Diversity Crisis, 1985, Edward O. Wilson, Bioscience, Volume 35. The Sixth Extinction, An Unnatural History, 2014, by Elizabeth Colbert, Bloomsbury. What Has Nature Ever Done for Us, 2013, Tony Juniper Profile. The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, 2010, Pushpan Kumar et al. Earthscan. So these are the sites for the interesting and valuable videos. So take a look at this. So thank you very much for your patience. And I hope you didn't dream during the lecture. Okay, so let's now see on the next YouTube lecture. Thank you very much for watching, and bye for now. Good night, and stay safe and stay healthy. Bye-bye.